Well, we're back, and I am crazy excited about this episode.
Why are you excited now?
Because for me, this episode, well, I just been through something pretty instrumental, and the many things prior to this experience had led me to have very deep insights to it, and I want to share those today. It's really about the receiver. It's actually what lies beyond a psychedelic state. So we have the episode on psychedelic states, but this is something else, and I'm really excited about it.
It might sound a little bit underplayed here, but literally we were going to have a whole other series. We have everything kind of planned out what we were going to be doing, and then for this Valentine's, she's like, no. This is what I want to go into. I want to go into receiving pleasure. I want to talk about this experience and share it with you all. So
yes. So first of all, this is for the Valentine's weekend. But as someone asked us earlier, I think a few days ago, like every day is a love day if you practice making love. So there we go. So take us in. Where should we start this conversation?
Well, I'm kind of playing with the title, the art and practice of receiving pleasure. Originally, it was just the art of it. But then you said, no, this is also a practice.
It is a practice.
And the reason why is because there is, in the same way that we sort of train ourselves to be able to deal with X amount of pain, or, we condition ourselves to work out harder, push ourselves farther, we don't really think about, well, do we have such a thing as a pleasure capacity, and can that actually be increased?
And I just want to say here, this isn't just for those typically on the receiving end and you get all the pleasure and then there's a really hard-working giver. This is pleasure capacity for everyone, no matter what role you are engaged in within the act.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that if you're a giver and you're not practicing actually experiencing pleasure while you're in your giving, it's going to get boring or tiring or annoying or whatever after a while. And if you can really feel and have amazing sensation for yourself while you're also giving pleasure,
yes,
then you'll probably want to do it more, and you're going to explore a lot of different ways to expand pleasure.
We're definitely going to be challenging some of the beliefs around receiving and giving.
Yes, exactly. But I would just want to say that at the start, so that those of you who don't identify as receivers, let's say, go, oh, this is not an episode for me.
This is specifically for you.
Yeah, this is for everyone, actually.
Well, first of all, let's go into what is the difference between receiving and giving on just a basic level. Mm-hmm. So receiving is that when someone or something is doing something for the receiver's pleasure. So if you're the receiver, then that means someone else or some tool or toy or whatever it might be is doing the action, and it's for your pleasure, for your benefit. Mm-hmm. Now, giving is doing something, but for the other person's benefit. And this is really important because these two commonly get mixed up.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Exactly. How do they get mixed up?
Well, I can't tell you how many times. Well, let me give you a client story. This is not specific to one client. This is almost unanimous across
too many.
All clients that are dealing with mismatched arousal, or if one person's like, I have low desire, and the other person's like, oh, my partner never wants me. There's normally something going on around this. Okay. And what happens is a lot of times, and frankly, it ends up being kind of the guy and the girl, though it's also happened when we have also then been counseling. It was a lesbian couple that we were actually working with. And so again, you have the giver who is supposedly thinking that they're doing something for the other person's benefit, but the truth is they're doing something and it's really just giving them pleasure.
So they're taking.
So they're actually really taking.
Which is also fun sometimes.
Completely fun. But it ends up it creates problems though, if then especially that's complemented by the mistake on the receiver, who's like, okay, I'll let you do this because it's really for you. And so then they get resentful because they're actually allowing, which is also perfectly fine. But if it's supposed to be something that's going to help them get charged up, help them feel better in a way that it's for them and not for the other person, then now they're not really receiving. And so there's just a mixed match. And there's nothing wrong. In fact, it can be amazing to go into the taking and allowing dynamic.
Receiving is not easy. Real receiving is actually incredibly vulnerable because it requires a letting go of control on some level and a deepening to being attentive to your senses, your sensuality. So you can't abandon yourself. You can't kind of dissociate. In real receiving, you're deeply associated. You're deeply in the experience. And through that act of deep receiving, you actually, I think, can take the giver into a whole other state of being.
I mean, when we get into our story, that definitely was an experience for me. But I love what you're saying because there is so little focus put on receiving. Most tips, tricks, and techniques are about doing. They're about actually giving pleasure. And that's even if it's just to ourselves or to somebody else. And basically when it goes into receiving, you just hear, let go, maybe surrender, or just lay back, which
relax.
is then relax. But these are things that's like, okay, but how do I actually do that? And what you're talking about, though, is that there is an actual part of receiving that is highly active.
Yes, and that's what I love about your work with Section Sex, is you introduced, I think, to this whole field, this concept of active receiving and
adaptive giving, yes.
I
was like waiting for you to say it. But this is really important, though, because we're starting now to see a little bit of this terminology beginning to spread. I mean, very small.
Which is good.
Which is good. But, the source of it is, yes, myself. And it came from really working with people that had trauma, people that had a lot of difficulties. Could be everything from like penetration anxiety to past rape experiences. And this is the other part of why this conversation matters, not just because people hardly ever learn about receiving, but when working with people that were struggling with, past traumas, with pain,
where intimacy
with anxiety.
is a stress.
Exactly. They thought their biggest fear would actually be facing the past, facing the pain.
Facing the trauma or the whatever.
And whether it was a psychological pain or whether it was a physical pain, physiological one. The thing that ended up happening, though, is that they're most afraid of was actually being able to embrace pleasure. And this is then, again, why just even talking about the word pleasure can be really just triggering for a person. I mean, we have movies that are rated less in terms of like the age limit that they can watch them, especially in the West, if there is violence and these different things and pain and scare and like fear, it'll be like a PG-13 movie. But the second that like pleasure and sexuality goes into it, it gets very quickly into the R-rated. Need to be over 18 for pleasure.
Oh, it makes sense because some people want to protect, the kids. But I do think teenagers these days have seen way more than what's on movies.
Well, but I mean, it's also interesting though that you could have people getting shot up and be able to handle that before you would be able to handle a sexual scene.
It's true. I mean, even on the news or whatever, like if you hear or see scenes of pain, you almost don't register it. But the second you hear just that little sound, it's like everyone's nervous system prickles up. Like, what's that? And the thing that I've seen, say, in my own family is I have a family member. When she was born into a very difficult situation. And that situation was extreme stress. So she was used to anger and yelling and unhappiness and stress. She was relaxed in that environment as a baby. The second someone would be laughing or joyous, she would start to cry because her wires were crossed from a very young age. So that had to get uncrossed with time. But just to give perspective to people, we are conditioning our nervous system every single day by what we allow ourselves to pay attention to. And culturally, we're far more attuned and paying attention to all the pain and suffering in the world than we are just being with someone that we appreciate and actually taking a breath and touching their hand or just being with them and appreciating, really receiving like, oh wow, this is a beautiful moment, even if it's an ordinary moment.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about a fight, whether it's a physical altercation or a verbal one, much more soon than we'll go into details of having seen or overheard a sexual one.
Yes.
And also I think there's definitely parts of the world where you get used to the bangs and the loud sounds and even gunshots, that you'll find in the city. But then all of a sudden you start hearing like the neighbors having sex, and that's like, oh no, okay, that's a little bit too much. It's a little weird, or
well, it's triggering. I mean, it's an arousal sound, right?
Yes.
So it arouses. Arousal for some of us feels scary because for whatever reason, when our heart rate increases a little bit, arousal increases heart rate.
Yes.
That can feel distressing in the body. So one of the ways that I love how we work, and also a lot of the solo work that I've done for a long time with myself, is around relaxed arousal. It's this resiliency between what's known as sympathetic or arousal and parasympathetic rest and restoration. This aspect of fluidity between those states and actually activating both in a way that allows relaxation and arousal to coexist is a very special state. And I think it's not studied yet, but I think it will be. And they're going to find more resiliency emerge from people who practice relaxed arousal.
Well, I want to hear a little bit about
my mouth's all watery.
Story.
Yes. Okay. So I want to give some context.
Yes.
The day before the amazing thing happened, an amazing trigger happened. And the trigger was so, I think, old. It just went right into like alarm zone instantly. It went from green zone to red zone in half a flash. And then things cascaded around it to make it like a domino effect. And so the things I knew to do typically to bring my heart rate down and to relax myself and get untriggered were not actually working. I exercised. I was there on that treadmill and my heart rate was, like you could see, because I monitor it every day, it was really high in the yellow, almost red zone. Typically it's blue and green. So
also your aura ring.
Everything was freaking out.
It was like everything. Saying, like, you're stressed, you're not sleeping.
I'm like, shut up, I know I'm stressed.
That's stressing me out more.
I did deep breathing. I did sound. I did a lot of the things I know to bring this down. But it was so incredibly alarming that almost nothing was working. So I just want to contextualize that because the journey that we went on not only downregulated me to a point of being neutral, where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm back. It actually then took me into such a deep place of the green zone. There was a zone I'd never been to before. It was almost like the Emerald City in the green zone. And so that incredible nervous system journey was very drastic, and it happened in less than 24 hours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what did you kind of learn then from that experience? Like, what was some of the felt state change that happened? And
well, I'll just share there was a process. So
yes.
There was the trigger, and then I had a really bad dream. So it was like a culmination, I think, of the day. I went to sleep and I wasn't happy, and so I had this nightmare, and I woke up and I wasn't feeling well, and we connected sexually, but we weren't talking. We didn't really talk about the day. We didn't process the day. For some reason, we both kind of knew, let's not talk. Like, you need to regulate yourself. I was attempting to do that. But our bodies wanted to communicate. And I woke you up, I think, because I'd had this horrible nightmare. And I'm like, I just really, like, I need to feel you inside me. Like, it was like medicine, sex as medicine. Like, I need this now. I need to eradicate the darkness that I'm experiencing. Yeah. And the process of our lovemaking in that moment really did take me from what felt really dark and yucky and scary into, oh, okay, I can breathe again. I feel love and joy again. I'm good. But it felt more like a neutral place. And then we paused, and I think you went off and took care of yourself. And I slept
by taking care of myself, meaning like I de-armored myself. I took like tension out of my own pelvic floor.
Yeah, and why would you do that in the midst of all this?
Well, I did it because I had a strong feeling that we are going to be diving into some of the depths of pleasure. And when your body is generating that amount of pleasure, like, my system needs to be open to receiving it. Both just energetically to like just stay in tuned, also to like feel the benefits and impact of it. But then also too, like just if I'm not like able to calibrate myself and keep an open system, then like the chance of like premature ejaculation or like just like anything like penetration anxiety or light, yeah. Just the ability though to like really cycle that amount of energy through my body and really absorb all the benefits of it, then and that's even not from me like in the receiving side, it's for me in the giving side, because it just starts to cascade off of you.
So I like that you're saying that, because often we do focus on fixing or prepping the receiver.
Yes.
But we don't often talk about prepping the giver, so that the giver's pelvic floor, the giver's genitals, the giver's heart, the giver's system is also in a space where if the receiver is generating this massive amount of energy and pleasure, that can be digested and not just throw you off.
Well, the importance as well, because I think we're not quite done yet with the why this really matters, just to drive it home. You've been reading a book. I want you to just mention a little bit about.
Oh yeah, Cassie, Dr. Cassie Means' book. I'm telling everyone to read it. It's amazing. And it's called Good Energy. And there's a lot to the book. Like, it's a rich and profound book. But when you get to the end of the second part, which is the final chapter of the second part, she talks about fearlessness.
Yes.
And living fearlessly. And that is one of the big things that I love to talk about, and how what we pay attention to, what we digest. But essentially the book is, what are all the things you're doing throughout your day that tilt you towards bad energy and therefore getting sick and not being well and everything kind of falling apart, versus what are all the things that you could do throughout your day that tilt you and create good energy and actually allow you to live an extraordinary life no matter what is going on around you.
Well, I thought it was interesting too, because in that part of the book, she's speaking specifically as well around the different effects that how the psychology affects one's biochemistry via the neurotransmitters, our hormones, inflammation. And she literally like lists off a whole list of things that come through negative psychological health, which is fear and stress.
Yes. And she was saying that you could biohack everything and do everything right, but if you don't fix this fear-based orientation, you're just going to eradicate any kind of goodness that you're creating in these little micro-hacking moments.
So for those of you out there, I'm going to actually read through some of the list of the negative fears and stress. So for those of you out there who are like, I'm the giver, I struggle with receiving, this isn't really for me. Or even if you're a receiver and you're like, okay, I receive enough, these are some of the things that can happen if we don't actually take the time to reduce psychological stress and fear. And she talks about chronic inflammation, especially in the brain, goes up. The oxidative stress, our ability not to be able to process things like amino acids, our insulin resistance. So
makes you fat.
The mitochondrial health.
Yeah, that's a problem of every disease.
Yep. And so that's something a lot to do with like the mitochondria in the gut, the ability to really get energy from your food, your sleep, everything else. And then you also have tons of worse metabolic markers. And she mentioned obesity, lower HDL, increased visceral fat, larger waist circumference, higher blood pressure, LDL, your increased heart rate, as well as cortisol levels. And another...
So just modern living, essentially.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, and then, yes, she definitely talks about the amount of screen time that we have, the poor sleep cycles that we have, the type of foods that we're consuming. I mean, on and on and on, just as like you said, modern day living. Yeah. Now, the part that was interesting is that she was saying that in addition to the psychological stress, which can be the kind of more chronic ones and small things that we do, or little micro violations to ourselves, then there's also some of these like deeper traumas, a traumatic experience that may have happened, and then the effects that has, such as like childhood traumas, for instance. And she was saying that her kind of number one go-to suggestions, and it was an extensive list, was one, like go to a therapist, breath work, nature, mindfulness, meditation, anything that's going to help you lower your heart rate variability, the ability to do like body scans throughout the day, the aromatherapy. She mentioned lavender. I thought one of the things that was really interesting, especially on nature, it wasn't just about going into nature, but the cycles.
Being exposed to the cycles of nature.
The cycles of nature, and then also physically exposed to it, but then also just understanding that life and death happen. But the big one that stood out for me is she says the natural cycle between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So keep that one in mind, because we're going to get into that. And then the need for awe, abundance, and gratitude, becoming less busy, community, and then psychedelics.
Well, the main reason we're bringing all this up is we're wanting to normalize the practice of generating pleasure. Mm-hmm. And what I was surprised with her extensive research, her extensive list, is there was no mention, direct mention of pleasure, especially generated through the body. And what is one of the most generative areas of pleasurable sensation are the genitals.
Yes.
So I find that really interesting, and I just wanted to do a shout out because we have interviewed other doctors, and one I'm thinking is Olivia, where we were discussing with her, and we're like, I think medical doctors should prescribe self-pleasure and pleasure as a self-regulation practice, because people are dysregulated and they really need a daily way to get more regulated. She goes, oh my God, that's genius. I've never thought of it that way. That's definitely a yes. And so I'm hoping as we start to bring our ideas out to you and you start talking about it, that we normalize sexuality, we normalize actually practicing generating pleasure between partners, because a lot of times sex can be mostly pleasurable in the beginning of a relationship, and then after that it's kind of a chore for a lot of people.
And normally pleasurable also has this kind of like fieriness and passion to it and young love, and this gets into then what I was saying about the natural cycles of nature. And this is probably why there's a whole taboo around sexual pleasure, but even just pleasure in general. I mean, medical society is typically solving dysfunctions. They're not really going into optimization. Yeah. And so when you're talking now about pleasure, you're really stepping into more, would probably align better with functional medicine, which is who we are normally then talking with. But this cycle, though, being able to go from the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, is so crucial. And the way that if sex is spoken about as hot and fiery and pleasurable is, and this is actually what we've had Lauren Davis on with her husband as well, Dr. Craig Wells, but we had a separate conversation where she was speaking about the importance of actually having a parasympathetic state of pleasure. And if we go towards this peak orgasm, which is, your system gets aroused, erect, you have an orgasm, and then everything drops off and you have a refractory period. And we're talking both for men as well as women, that what ends up happening is you're not really regulating your nervous system. And so some of the things that she was mentioning, which was genius about the way that we actually are teaching sex, and specifically as well suction sex technology, but then with what you're teaching women with the jade egg practice and even just mind frames, is that it creates this parasympathetic state. And I think that's kind of where you found a big parallel between this weekend's experience and a parasympathetic state experience that you'd had.
Yeah,
personally.
Well, I know we're going to share a lot in the explicit part, but just before we jump into that, I'd love to just mention a completely different experience that then educated me and prepared me to have the conscious know-how and the language to actually decipher what happened.
Yes.
Because it's really incredible, and I want all of you to have this
experience. Because we hear parasympathetic state, but
we're like, well, what?
What is that? So
exactly.
Tell us how you had the experience.
So I went to see an incredible physician, Dr. Tudor.
Recommended by?
Katrine Volitsky.
Who's an amazing...
all in Sedona. And essentially what he does, he works with the nervous system. He's treated a lot of trauma through procaine injections, which is a little bit like putting like a reset button on your nervous system. If your nervous system's always firing in a stress loop, it's an interrupter, and it resets everything.
And it doesn't even have to be a hugely active one that you're dysfunctional. This could be even just, this could just be things that are cycling kind of like below the surface because you've just gotten used to it. So most people don't know what it's like to truly.
But I wanted to, that's how his work started though, with like war veterans and PTSD and just trying to help them get out of extreme PTSD because they're just not enjoying life.
That chronic state of fear and stress.
Exactly. And then he's also became an osteopath, which is an incredible combination because osteos have this incredible way to touch and listen to the body and really hear what's needed. So he readjusted everything in my system prior to any of the injections, which already was what just happened. I have a brand new body. But then I received the injections, and as I was experiencing the Procaine, a lot of interesting things happened. And I said, the closest I can remember feeling this way would be floating on a lake or the sea where my ears are submerged, so the sound changes, and I'm floating, but I'm perfectly safe and really relaxed and just happy. There's nowhere I need to be. There's nothing to do. There's just this...
You're kind of like merged with the environment. So this happened, and it was very educational because I'm always teaching how do you downregulate, but I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever downregulated this much. And then I was quite high, and I said, what's going on? He said, no, the treatment's finished. It's been finished for a while. This is just you in a parasympathetic state. I'm like, well, this is very different than relaxation, It was a very nourishing state. So the reason I'm sharing all that is the experience that I recently had with you, where we moved from a big trigger into nightmare, into reset, and then into a whole other category of sexual experience. Well,
this then applied because I was like, it feels exactly like I've just had that same treatment.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because there is a huge fascination in the sexual space for those who are trying to explore this of how do I have these expanded states of pleasure, these extended states of pleasure, like the orgasm that lasts for an hour or whatever else. And in these talks, normally it's always the weight is put on the giver. And we even have this, I can't tell you how many clients who are typically on the receiving side, or let's say then it's not just women. I mean, like when we've coached gay men, like that are on the bottoms or whatever, like they're like, I need to find the perfect top. I need to find the perfect giver, the knight in shining armor that's going to make everything suddenly work out.
Give you a million orgasms.
Precisely. And then they could be with someone and they just don't have it. And the fact is that, well, it might not just be the person on the giving side. It could be that you haven't really taken the time to open one system.
I can totally, like just myself, because I'm a very practitioner of pleasure. And there's moments when I am shut down or stressed and my receiving capacity is low.
Yes.
I could, with the same lover, in all the amazingness that lover brings, suddenly like feel bored or I don't feel anything. There's a numbness and I'm like, what's this? It was so extraordinary like yesterday. Why is it like this now? And a lot of it has to do with my receptivity, my capacity. Like, can you track all the sensations that are happening? And when you numb out and dissociate, you can't.
Yes. Well, and this is, I think, something that was really incredible about your experience with Dr. Tudor is that normally he does not do as many injections in one session, but he was saying to you, because of the practice that you did, because he's reading your body the whole time, he's like, oh, you're actually open to receive more, and so I'll go with this nerve ganglion, and then I'll go with that nerve ganglion.
And he was quite amazing. He goes, well, usually typically when I do this particular ganglia, well, people have flashbacks, and so I'm okay with that. And if you have very intense emotions or you flashback and you yell or you do whatever, it's all good. I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm like almost like
bracing
like what's gonna happen when and he's like, it's a truth serum. I'm like, shit, what's gonna come out?
And he says so many people have gone in there who are, like supposedly masters at having dealt with X trauma.
They did all their work,
all the therapy and stuff, and then
they injected. And so he's like, so, are you okay? And I'm like, I feel really peaceful. And he's like, okay, well, how about now? I'm like, yeah, I'm still feeling very peaceful. And then he'd inject again another area, and he's like, and now? I'm like, so peaceful. And he's like, okay, you clearly have done that work. So the reason we're bringing these stories in is to inspire you that no matter where you are, even at the most starting place, you can entrain your system to feel more and to have more nuances and keep expanding pleasure more and more. I have to say, I mean, I've practiced pleasure all my life, and I'm still like crossing thresholds even just a few days ago. So,
which is incredible.
Yeah.
Well, before we jump over, I just want to we're going to get into the more specifics of the sexual story.
What happened, yeah.
What happened, how that happens,
all
how
the
that can
things
be
we did
recreated.
also, yeah.
Precisely. But just for our free membership, the people who are listening, when we talk about the importance of being an active receiver and adaptive giver, there's a kind of image that typically comes to people's minds. So I wanted you to kind of talk a little bit about how a misconception of the active receiver.
Either you have the starfish receiver, right?
Meaning that you just lay there with arms and legs
spread and mouth open, whatever, and there's...
Which is, of course, the advice that most people get, which is just let go, surrender, and they're like, okay, I'm just not going to do anything.
Exactly. Or sometimes people just don't know what to do. So
Precisely.
then they just kind of lay there going, I don't know what to do with this.
Which makes it really difficult then to know, is the person disassociating?
Correct.
Also, too, if you have any anxiety, then you have no control over the situation. So there's that missing step of active receiving. So that's one side.
Spectrum. Mm-hmm. The whole other spectrum is someone who puts on a big show but still isn't feeling anything. Yes. But they're thrashing and throwing their hair and lashing around and screaming and screeching and scratching someone's back and doing all these gestures
being
a fantastic receiver. But meanwhile, they're not receiving anything. They're not feeling anything.
Actually, what they're doing is they're trying to give pleasure to their partner, so that either their partner feels like, oh, I'm really doing an amazing job, or they don't want them to get bored.
Not that there's anything wrong with thrashing and scratching backs.
Completely not. In fact, the body will go towards that naturally. But if you can't feel yourself and actually receive
or if you're trying
the
to
sensations,
emulate what you've seen in porn or movies, that's essentially how most of us learn. We look, our mirror neurons then try and replicate, right?
Yes.
So that's how we learn how to dance, how we learn a sport or a martial arts, or how to cook. Like, we first look, like if I remember my mom, how she used to cut, I'm like, how does she do that? But I'm watching her, and then when she's not looking, I'm trying to practice that same thing, and then when she comes back, I kind of, but that's how we're learning. And so we're not given fantastic visual experiences of what an active receiver is.
Well, because most of the visual experiences we see is actually a performative act.
Yes.
So any of the limbic resonance is going to be lost.
Exactly.
Because you're watching someone else perform. Plus, there are so many things internally that we'll get into in the members area about how using your pelvic floor, using your breath, all these things that then create that what would look like performative feeling, because then the body's just expressing itself.
Exactly.
And that's very different. The other part too is the adaptive giver part. And I think how that can be misconstrued a lot of time is that, being an adaptive giver means just
ground and pound.
That's the opposite of being adaptive. That's your traditional.
But that's the assumption, right?
True. Most givers, it's like harder, faster, create overwhelm in that person's body. Yeah. Or the other side is the just eye gaze, just be present and protect the other person. Make them feel really safe.
Yes.
And there is nothing wrong with safety, but that's kind of like the foundation.
That should already be in place. Yeah.
I mean, hopefully you feel safe with your parents, but that doesn't mean that then you're going into ecstatic, pleasurable states at all. In fact, if that happens, then there's a whole other conversation to have. But the main thing, though, is that when we're talking about a sexual experience, the ability to be an adaptive giver, and frankly, even just the idea that these two things are separate. So, is that you as a giver, you need to be able to be, one, aware of yourself, which is what you're talking about. your own level of pleasure. What I was speaking about, how open is your own body? Where is your own heart and emotions at? Are you emotionally available for these experiences? Because when you go into deep states of receiving,
there's no words anymore.
There's no words anymore. But also too, that integration time after is so important to feel nurtured. And so if you're not emotionally available, then a lot of times the receiver won't go into that state. And if they do, then they just can kind of feel abandoned. But even beyond these things of being able to really track the other person's breath and what do you do with that. But
you're also nuancing how you feel through all parts of your body, whether you're using mouth, fingers, or genitals, how you're feeling and sensing what's the cascading waves and explosions and all kinds of things that are going on within the body, or even sometimes the stillness.
Yes. So that's the heightened awareness that comes along. But then the other part the awareness is really with yourself, but then the ability to attune, to take that heightened state of awareness, not just get lost in yourself.
And to be curious. I mean, I just find you extremely innovative. Because you're listening and you're innovating. You're not repeating a routine.
That's the adaptive giver. It feels much more like jazz.
Yeah.
You're not just sitting back there and watching. You're not just
now
creating
it's
safety.
Time for this thing.
You're interacting with this other person. And then ultimately even moving beyond the separation of receiver, giver, active receiver, adaptive giver, and finding this synchronicity.
Yeah, where everything just starts to be one informed ecstatic state.
Exactly. And that is some of the magic which we're going to talk about
I'm
as
excited.
we go over into the members area. So if you're watching this and you're curious, definitely go check it out, because you're not going to want to miss out what we're about to speak about.
To join us for the complete and explicit version of this podcast, just simply upgrade your membership and you'll get instant access.